I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as Ukraine reels from yet another record drone bombardment, we look at warnings that Russia is massing 50,000 troops near Sumy ahead of a new offensive. We'll also be hearing Dom's interview with Estonia's defence minister about Moscow's shadow fleet and how to protect critical infrastructure from Russia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, 28th of May, 3 years and 94 days since the full-scale invasion began. In the absence of the usual team, I'll be hosting today, and I'm joined by our regular guest, Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, who will be kicking us off with the latest military and political updates. Joe, where do you want to start?
Hi, Venetia. Good to be back, folks. Hello. Yeah, and lots to cover in the absence of Dom and Francis. So I'm going to slam together the military and diplomatic updates for you today. Let's start with Ukraine has launched a large-scale drone attack on Russia overnight, forcing the closure of multiple airports, especially in the Moscow region. Kyiv's forces were said to have struck the Mikron microelectrics plant in Zelenograd, which is a key producer of electronic components, semiconductors, all used as part of Russia's defense industrial base, developing missiles, air defense systems, radar systems, the lot. 13 regions were targeted, including Moscow, to name a few others: Bryansk, Belgorod, Vlodomyr, Uga, Kursk, and Tula. That's just a few of the regions that were targeted. Reportedly, Russian air defenses were said to have shot down 296 Ukrainian drones across those multiple regions. That's from Russia's defense ministry. Always likes to claim that it has downed all of the drones, but we have seen some videos that purport to be Ukrainian drones landing on targets. The attack came after President Vlodomyr Zelensky promised a response to Russia's recent spate of long-range attacks on Ukrainian cities. That was in last night's national address that he always delivers, uploads it on Telegram, Instagram, etc. But he didn't actually specify how Ukraine would respond, and Kyiv is yet to comment on this latest drone attack. But if the numbers that Russia is speaking about, 296 drones across multiple regions, that would represent one of the largest Ukrainian drone attacks since the full-scale invasion began. More on Russia's ability to continue waging war from President Zelensky, who briefed journalists in Ukraine before his trip to Germany, which I'll come on to shortly, as he's saying that Russia is preparing to produce 300 to 350 drones per day. This is their real situation. They were tasked with having 500 per day. So he's speaking about the number of drones that Russia can produce in any one day, ready to attack Ukraine with. He's saying they're a long way away from this sort of much vaunted number of 1,000 single drones in one launch, but they do continue, despite all of these Western sanctions, despite the West's attempts to clamp down on Russia's military industrial base. They continue to switch this war footing and focus their economy on producing these drones en masse. Zelensky has said Ukraine is capable of launching around 100 long-range drones daily, but with the support of partners, it could actually catch up to that number of what Russia is producing, of around 300, 350 each day. So that's quite interesting, because Zelensky has been urging his European partners to not just donate weapons, but actually to invest in helping Ukraine increase its production capacity. It thinks it has, Ukraine, has plenty of redundancy in the system, but needs money to basically build these things. And that's what he has been appealing to Western leaders for of late. On to a bit of Russian force regeneration. Zelensky says Russia is mobilizing around 40 to 45,000 men for its military every month. That is compared to Ukraine, which we believe mobilizes around 25 to 27,000 a month. So according to these Ukrainian estimates, which are broadly accepted as accurate by Western intelligence services. So those numbers are right. But what that would do is just about replenish what Russia is losing per month in manpower. So again, Ukrainian estimates broadly accepted by Western intelligence. Russia loses around 1,000 men killed or wounded every day. It's about 900, just under 1 million since the full-scale invasion started. So the level of mobilization Russia is going through at the moment, that 40 to 45,000 men, plugs that gap. But what sort of experts and observers of the war and the full-scale invasion say is it's probably not enough mobilization to dramatically shift the course of the war. It's enough to plug those gaps and keep Russia creeping forward, but it's not enough mass to really break the Ukrainian lines and advance at any sort of speed. And then a few more updates from the battlefield. Russian forces are accumulating 50,000 troops near Ukraine's northeast Sumy region, where they are aiming to create a 10-kilometer buffer zone in that area. That's according to President Zelensky, who says now they're accumulating troops in the direction of Sumy, over 50,000. We understand, but have had success there. Don't quite know what he means by the have success. Ukraine, from Sumy, has launched various attacks into Belgorod, Russian oblast, but also into Kursk, which was the highly publicized first major foreign invasion of Russia since the Second World War. But it does look like Russia is putting together a concerted effort to basically prevent that from happening again. So reinforcing on the border up to 50,000 men, according to President Zelensky. Russia has said its military has captured another village in Ukraine's Sumy region, where this buffer zone is being put together. In a social media post by Russia's defense ministry, it said its troops have captured the village of Konstantinivka, which sits just inside the Ukrainian border. Lots of towns and villages by that name, but this one is in Sumy rather than elsewhere. Another update, this time from our friends at the Institute of the Study of War. They say Russia is laying the groundwork to permanently annex and integrate the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant into its power grid. This is a major escalation, according to the Washington-based think tank. It suggests the broader annexation plans in southern Ukraine. Satellite images show 90 kilometers of new power lines being laid, and Rosatom is planning to restart the plant's reactors soon. Russia has previously agreed with the UN's nuclear watchdog that restarting the plant was impossible without major safety improvements, which indicates a change in Russia's sort of long-term occupation intent. Now let's move to the diplomatic and the political realm, where President Zelensky has essentially challenged Vladimir Putin to turn up to a three-way negotiation with himself and US President Donald Trump. You'll remember, I travelled to Istanbul for what was touted as being the first time that President Zelensky would meet his Russian opposite number since, I believe, December 2019. Putin never travelled. Instead, a sort of low-ranking Russian delegation met with a Ukrainian delegation. And this is what President Zelensky had to say in comments that were published this morning. If Putin is not comfortable with a bilateral meeting, or if everyone wants it to be a trilateral meeting, I don't mind. I am ready for any format. The Ukrainian president also said he would very much like Mr. Trump to hit Russia's banking and energy sectors with sanctions in a response to the wave of aerial attacks and Moscow's refusal to agree to this unconditional 30-day ceasefire. In classic airwave sparring, the Kremlin in response said a peace summit involving Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky can only happen once, and I quote, a concrete agreement, end quote, is reached between Russia and Ukraine. So essentially, Russia wants much of its concerns, what it calls its reasons for the war. Boy, it doesn't actually call it a war, special military operation in Moscow's eyes, like the apparent denazification of Ukraine, the sort of the borders it deems to be drawn in the sand before any negotiations. It wants all of these settled before there is any negotiations, where President Zelensky, much with Western backers, obviously want the ceasefire first and then negotiations, basically to take away some of that leverage from Putin. A spokesman for Putin said no decision had been taken on a venue for the next direct talks between Ukraine and Russia. But Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, has said that he liked Turkey. So potentially Istanbul again, potentially the Vatican has been muted as a host. And then finally, in more immediate news, President Zelensky has touched down in Germany today, where he's meeting the German Chancellor Friederich Merz in Berlin. It looks like Germany is going to unveil one of its largest single military packages in support of Ukraine. But in a change of tactics, I guess, Germany will no longer publish what is inside these packages. Lots of rumours suggest that there is going to be similar systems to HIMARS, which I believe will be the German M270, again, American-made, tracked multiple launch rocket systems and the ammunition, the GIMLARs for it, potentially some air defence, maybe some armoured vehicles. But to maintain some strategic ambiguity, Germany has decided to basically take the contents of the package off the table and keep it secret. This does open up questions over whether Germany will finally offer to donate its long-range Taurus missile, much debated weapon system. Before their meeting, Merz confirmed that Ukrainian forces are no longer bound by geographic limits when using German systems. So Ukraine can now also defend itself by attacking military positions in Russia, the Chancellor said. No, so before Zelensky arrived. There are no longer range restrictions on weapons delivered to Ukraine, neither by the British, nor by the French, nor by us, the Germans, or nor by the Americans, the Chancellor highlighted in a press conference that he gave on Monday. So that is obviously ripe for speculation. Has Germany finally decided to unleash the reins of the Taurus in the hands of the Ukrainians, which it previously under former Chancellor Olaf Scholz had refused to do because it basically triggered some fears in Berlin that it would start World War III. But we don't know, is simply the answer. What Bild, a German newspaper, and I believe actually Friedrich Merz has actually confirmed this in a press conference, but it's happening now and I need to go back and check that. But before that press conference, Bild was reporting that the German government is going to help finance Ukrainian efforts to design and produce a missile with a 2,500 kilometer range. So this could be the range that Merz was referring to rather than the Taurus. And then there's also the range of the HIMARS, the M270 variant that is also being donated apparently. And then finally, from me, some news on Vladimir Putin's latest peace demands. He has demanded a written pledge by NATO not to accept any more Eastern European members and the lifting of several sanctions as the condition for ending Russia's war in Ukraine. That was reported by Reuters, citing several undisclosed Russian sources. One of the senior Russian sources told Reuters, the news agency, Putin is ready to make peace, but not at any price. A ban on NATO's eastward expansion would rule out future accession for countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and others. So this is Vladimir Putin using Western desires to see the war in Ukraine come to an end, basically to stop any expansion of NATO. Do you remember NATO was never really in any sort of position to expand until Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, and then that triggered formerly neutral states, Finland and Sweden, to join. Ukraine is going to join one day. It has a sort of a well-lit bridge to membership, but the brakes are being put on that somewhat by the Americans and Donald Trump. So that's to be seen. But I think this will be one of those moments where Western leaders will come out and say that doesn't really work with NATO's open door policy. They're basically open to anyone who wants to join them, as long as you meet some criteria in terms of corruption on military standards, etc., and spending, of course. And we won't countenance that sort of demand from Putin, but it does also give Putin a demand and some leverage at the table, because Donald Trump could potentially say, I think I agree with that. NATO shouldn't be expanding. Vladimir, you should probably bring an end to your invasion, and then we will talk about that. Anyway, that's where I'll stop today, Venetia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. And yeah, I'm just going to pick up on, as you mentioned, as we're speaking right now, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Vlodomyr Zelensky are holding a press conference. I'm just going to bring you guys some lines from that. Merz has said that Russia's recent massive aerial strikes on Ukraine do not speak a language of peace, but speak the language of a war of aggression. So some backing for Ukraine amid the recent drone strikes. He also said that the attacks were a slap in the face of anyone working towards peace in Ukraine, Europe, and the United States. And he's vowed to increase pressure on Moscow and do everything necessary to make the Nord Stream 2 pipeline never able to be used again. And just picking up on that defence agreement that you mentioned, Joe, he confirmed that they did reach a new agreement on defence sector investments, but didn't give many more details. When he was asked whether Ukraine had been given the green light to use the German-made Taurus missiles that you mentioned as well, Merz said he didn't want to disclose details publicly, but he did say that Berlin wants to enable joint production of long-range missiles without limits. So that's probably that confirmation that you were alluding to there. That story is very much developing. The press conference is still ongoing, so do check the Telegraph live blog for more. I also wanted to pick up on something that was mentioned about 50,000 troops massing on the border of Ukraine. These are based on comments made earlier today by Vlodomyr Zelensky, according to Reuters. He said that more than 50,000 troops, including some of Russia's best forces, are being massed near Ukraine's northeastern Sumy region. He said that Kyiv is taking steps to prevent them from conducting a large-scale offensive, but said that it's part of this build-up, that Russia appears to be gearing up for a summer offensive in Ukraine while the peace talks continue to be strung out. So plenty to keep an eye on there. Now, over the last week or two, we've been hearing some of the reporting Dom Nichols, our associate editor for defence, did while he was in Estonia. Today we're going to hear his interview with Estonia's defence minister, Hanno Pevkur. They spoke about Russian jets violating Estonian airspace, Moscow's shadow fleet, and how to protect critical infrastructure. Here's their conversation.
Mr. Pevkur, you've been Estonia's defence minister since just after the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So lots of busy days, sleepless nights, I'm sure. This last week's probably been equally difficult. So last Thursday, so just 48 hours ago as we're recording this, a Russian jet violated your airspace, NATO airspace, Estonian airspace. This was after a Shadow Fleet tanker sailing between Estonia and Finland heading towards Russia was asked to stop and asked to comply with international maritime law by Estonian Coast Guard, failed to stop, and then Russia sent a jet over. That's been described as a failure of NATO, as in not taking any action against Russia for violating airspace. Do you regard it as such?
I disagree with this opinion or this description, because we have to look what was the purpose for our Navy to intervene, what we did and why we did. First, our main goal is to protect our critical infrastructure. This is why when we had the signal, when we had the information that there is a Shadow Fleet vessel without a flag approaching our cables, then we started to make measures immediately. So we checked the vessel. We also made necessary steps on the sea to identify the vessel, to see what its condition. And when it was over the cables, more or less it was clear for us that, okay, the threat for the cables is over. But still, there was a request to the ship to also to prove the ownership of the flag. They were not able to do that, and they just continued sailing. So this is why we decided that it is not necessary to onboard, which is normal, that when it's only the question of the paperwork, then this would have not been appropriate measure to onboard in that case.
For Estonian forces
Navy,
to go on to board the vessel.
And this is why we escorted the vessel out of Estonian jurisdiction. And this is what we did. So we acted, I would say, even with more forces than you would normally do with only this failure of paperwork. And it was overreaction from the Russian side. And when we take also the responsibility of Baltic air patrolling, then the responsibility is to, when we talk about the scramble, to identify and to escort out of Estonian airspace or NATO airspace these aircrafts. And these aircrafts were not hostile. And our responsibility, the NATO's responsibility, was to keep the airspace clean and safe. So this all was achieved. What happened actually was that Russia started to put it to its own source, to talk about their own narrative, that somehow we wanted to onboard. No, we didn't. There was no intention from the very beginning to go on board. And obviously we see that Russia started to use this case to talk about their narratives.
Now, you say it was an overreaction by Russia. How dangerous was it?
When you have the fighter jet close to Estonian or NATO territory, and even in NATO territory, still for a short while of time, it was around 1 minute. Then still, we have to understand it was a fighter jet. It was not a passenger plane. So this is why we took it very seriously. This is why our air patrolling mission, Portuguese F-16s, went to identify and to solve the situation. So every situation with Russian warship or fighter jet is very serious, and we are taking it very seriously.
Now, there's talk of you potentially going to NATO, to the North Atlantic Council, and invoking Article 4, as in requesting a discussion if there's a threat to sovereignty, on Monday. Are you going to go to NATO and ask such?
NATO meeting for defense ministers is planned for the 5th of June. What we will discuss, of course, we will give the overview. But what exactly will be our approach, it will be still under discussion, and let's see. But nevertheless, of course, we will give the overview to our NATO allies, not only on the political level, but also on the military level.
But you're not going to request anything earlier than the 5th of June?
I have to speak to the Minister of Foreign Affairs because we have not discussed that on the government.
Okay. Looking at the issue of the shadow fleet, Russia's shadow fleet more broadly, these often unflagged oil vessels, or vessels delivering Russia's oil and gas oil around the world. Do you think we understand the problem, we the West understand the problem of the shadow fleet correctly?
I believe that the understanding is there. And the question is that the consequences of that understanding or the actions based on that understanding might differ. And also how we see that. So from my point of view, and I believe also from the Baltic countries' point of view, of course, we would like to shut down any traffic regarding the shadow fleet, or at least sanctioned fleet, because there is a difference. When we take the vessels under the sanction, this is not correlating to the number of vessels we know which are part of the shadow fleet. Of course, I would like to see that every vessel sanctioned will not be able to sail on the Baltic Sea, but this is something we still have to discuss internationally.
I think the numbers are there's about 500 vessels that we think make up the shadow fleet, of which, depending on the jurisdiction and the country, only 350 or so have been
Correct.
sanctioned. You've said it's very difficult to get international consensus on sanctions against the shadow fleet. Why is it so difficult?
Because, as I said, different countries see the interpretation of international maritime law, UNCLOS, a bit differently. This is one. The other is that also the question of legal point of view of the shadow fleet, because officially these ships belong to some jurisdiction. Is it Gabon, is it Liberia, is it Cook Islands, whatever, but they belong to some jurisdiction. Now is a question that we define them as a shadow fleet, but there is no legal term of the shadow fleet. And this is why, as I said, the interpretation is different, but we all understand what that means these vessels are doing. And then they are transporting the oil from Russia outside of Europe, because European countries will not serve these vessels.
Now, the vessel in question from Thursday's incident, the Jaguar, is currently in the Russian port of Primorsk, expected to start heading back west through the Baltic Sea, possibly as early as tomorrow, but over the next few days. Foreign Minister from Lithuania has just said that this is a test for us. We have to go for it, i.e. to take enforcement action by NATO. Are you going to take such action?
We'll see how the situation will be laid out, because it might be that by that time this vessel has a flag already, because we've seen also in the history of that flag or of that vessel and in many other cases, then that the flags can be, let's say, acquired or put onto the ship very quickly. So then we have different situation again. Then we have the jurisdiction, then we have the vessel just cruising or sailing in international waters. So as I said, we are taking every case independently and monitoring the situation very closely.
Do you think Estonia is being unfairly held out to take action here? This is a NATO responsibility. It's a UN responsibility. UNCLOS is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Do you feel that people are just unfairly looking at Estonia to uphold international law, enforce the sanctions against the shadow fleet, shoot down Russian jets that violate your airspace? Are you being hung out to dry?
We do what we need to do. And as I said, the first goal for us is to protect the critical infrastructure. So when we have the critical infrastructure protected, then we can talk about also the safe sailing, about the international law. But in general, of course, we are also taking some steps on the international level because, yes, you rightly mentioned that this is not only the question of Estonia. It is the question of international community. And when we narrow it down, then it is the question of the Baltic Sea countries. We will discuss it, and let's see whether we can change something or do we need to change something or not.
Changing tack slightly, we just had an interesting session here at the Lennart Meri conference. You got into an interesting discussion with the German MP, the Bundestag member, Mr. Kiesewetter. You were asking him whether Germany is going to step up and become part of the coalition of the willing and whether or not Germany will up its defence spending to 3.5%. Were you satisfied with the answers you got?
We didn't get the yes or no answer, but I really do hope that, and then what I see also from the actions of the new coalition in Germany, that defence is more important, that there is a decision of 1 trillion package. Now we have to see how quickly they can implement that and to what it will be invested in. So this is something, one is to have some answers on the panel of international conference, and the other thing is to see actions in real life.
And it's expected that at the NATO summit in The Hague in June, that the defence spending commitment will go up to 3.5% for heavy metal, for want of a better phrase, the sort of hard defence capability, and 1.5% for wider defence spending on intelligence and infrastructure. So a 5% target. How many allies do you think are going to be able to make that?
When we want to come out from this summit as one, with one position, then everybody has to accept this.
Who are care to say if there are, but how many allies are reluctant in the conversations you're having to discuss raising defence spending to 5%?
I believe this is not for the open discussion that who is pro and who is against. What I can say that the last Foreign Affairs Council in Antalya, in Turkey, was rather optimistic in that regard. And we are moving towards the goal of 5% rather successfully, and then with more countries on board already, and still some who need more debates domestically.
But you're confident that in June that will go through, that NATO will adopt a 5% target?
I believe that there will be an understanding that yes, 5% is the overall spending on defense. The question will be rather that what we will include into that definition. And will there be, because we have a very clear understanding that we cannot change definition of defense spendings what NATO has today. Let's see what will be the latest outcome and the result. But at the moment, I'm more optimistic as I was a month ago.
On defence spending, there's more actual spending and greater pledges of increase in spending the further north and further east you go in Europe, in the alliance. Do you think the model of the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, always being a Brit, can withstand the changes that the alliance is going through?
I will not concentrate so much on the positions of specific countries. From our point of view, I would say that when the DCAM is coming from Britain, or DSAC, is coming from Britain, is okay because Britain is a framework nation also for us. But this is not the purpose or the goal to have DSAC from Britain. It's more about the finding the consensus and keeping the unity. That we have European countries, we have United Kingdom, we have US, we have Canada. And in that sense, I believe that we should not focus on the persons or on the positions, but we should more focus on the principles and on the values what NATO is carrying.
On the principles, do you detect any detachment from NATO by the US? There's talk of the US withdrawing troops from Europe, perhaps as early as later this year. Do you think there is a detachment from this current administration?
It is not a secret that the US administration has said very clearly their main focus will be shifted to Indo-Pac. Internationally, of course, the main focus still is domestically, but I believe that Europe needs to adapt to that understanding. We just don't know how that will be in real life. And this should be not as a problem for Europe, but this should be as a possibility, as an opportunity for Europe to do something more itself. We've heard good messages, good signals from Germany. We've seen that many countries are doing already 2, going to 3, many to 5, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. So this is an opportunity for Europe, I would say, and we should take that we will be more capable of fighting. We will have more capabilities in Europe, and this should be our possibility, not that we are complaining that US will withdraw or something. No, let's concentrate on that, what we can do, not that what the US is doing or not doing.
And just finally, there's been talk of European NATO nations taking more responsibility for a nuclear umbrella. There's discussion about French jets being based in Germany, for example. Do you feel sufficiently covered by the British and French NATO nuclear umbrella? Or do you think, particularly for Britain, having just the one submarine at sea at all times with nuclear weapons on board, is that just too blunt a tool? It doesn't give a range of options below strategic nuclear missiles. Do you welcome this debate in Germany and Poland at the moment about other nuclear options short of strategic nuclear weapons?
Nuclear deterrence means that you have nuclear capability. When we take the Second World War, basically it was enough to have one, okay, it was 2, but it was enough to have one nuclear bomb to execute that deterrence into the action.
But if Russia put an armoured division into Narva, do you think Britain would resort to nuclear weapons for that?
For using the nuclear weapon, there are definitely different escalation ladders which have to be fulfilled. So we will not discuss openly what these ladders are or steps of the ladder. But when we talk about minor intrusion or minor territorial loss in Estonia, this can be only temporary, and then we can kick Russians out ourselves. So this is not a question. The question is broader. And of course, nuclear deterrence means that this is basically the last resort for you. So that means that we've come to the situation where the conventional war is already stuck somehow, or many other steps. This is not a, let's say, very good comparison that will someone use nuclear weapon because of losing a very small territory of one country.
Hanno Pevko, thanks very much for talking to Ukraine the Latest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from our chief foreign analyst, Roland Oliphant. He's currently out in Armenia reporting on the dilemma facing small former Soviet Union states in the midst of what some politicians there are describing as a geopolitical earthquake.
Hello, Venetia. Hello, Joe. Right now, I'm sitting somewhere in the mountains in Armenia. I've spent the past couple of days in Yerevan, attending a conference with an awful lot of people from all over the world, really. It's been very interesting. Obviously, a lot of Armenians, a lot of people from other parts of the former Soviet Union, but also there was an Iranian delegation, there have been Americans, there have been all kinds of people you wouldn't necessarily see in the same room. The Hungarian foreign minister was here, quite forcefully putting Hungary's well-known position on global affairs. So it's been very interesting. I think there's two things to take away here. One is about the specific conflict here in the southern Caucasus. There is a really big push, at least from the Armenian side, to finally put an end to the 30-year conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We are told, or at least the message from the Armenian side, is that the text of a peace treaty, which would put an end to this, has been written up and finalised, and all they're negotiating now is when to sign it. If that goes through, that could be a very big moment for the South Caucasus, put to bed, obviously, a very long-running, very bitter conflict. It would also, interestingly, in this part of the world, open 2 borders. It's only got 2 of its borders. It's got 4 borders, 2 of them are open, one with Iran, one with Georgia, but the one with Turkey and one with Azerbaijan are closed. And I think this is where the second point comes in. One of the messages we've been getting from Armenian politicians, Armenian MPs, diplomats, those kinds of people, is that, look, they kept on using the metaphor of an earthquake. There is a geopolitical earthquake going on right now, and there is a real dilemma for small countries about whether you can try to be non-aligned, try and navigate your way between the great powers, or whether you need to be fully aligned with a bloc in some sense. And part of their rationale for all this, and you have to understand this is one side of a conflict, it's not Azerbaijan. There weren't any Azerbaijanis here, I'm not sure if any were invited. But part of their rationale is, look, if Armenia, but also Georgia and also actually Azerbaijan is to get through this moment of geopolitical flux, they're going to have to work together because they are essentially caught between three former colonial empires that ruled all three of them at various points. Those are, of course, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And therefore, the message that we're getting is that peace is absolutely essential. But that's not to say, I know that's not necessarily directly related to Ukraine, but in a way it is, because all eyes are on what's happened in Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine. Armenia's relationship with Russia was very badly undermined by Russia's, from the Armenian point of view, failure to protect them from Azerbaijan. That was largely because Russia was preoccupied fighting in Ukraine. And it is one part of the big geopolitical earthquake they're talking about. The other debate, I think, which is something we come up against on battle lines quite a lot, but of course it relates to Ukraine, is the global context between the populist Trumpian right and the more traditional liberal internationalists. There was a much bigger presence of what you might call the more populist camp. Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, was here. We had a Brexit-supporting British MP, Peter Sihato of Hungary. So that debate is really live. And one of the messages that we got from a very pro-European Armenian MP was, look, obviously it's a long road to Europe, but we don't even know what the European Union is going to look like by the time we might get through the door. So there's a big question about the world we are entering. So that's the really interesting discussion has been about. Essentially, it's focused on that fact, this recognition that we are in a moment of historical flux, and a recognition that places like this, in this kind of historical borderland, are likely to feel the impact of that, perhaps more than others. What else can I say? There is another interesting indirect impact of the war here. A huge number of Russians came through Armenia, fleeing Russia at the start of the war. I actually the airline misplaced my suitcase on the way here. I had to go out and buy a suit to go and look respectable at a conference. And I was shocked to find the prices it was London prices for clothes, or even more. I mentioned this to an Armenian diplomat last night, and she said, oh yeah, absolutely. We had this because of the war in Ukraine. I said, why the war in Ukraine? She said, a huge number of Russians came down, but it's the Russians who can afford to travel. So essentially, massive influx of kind of, I suppose, the Muscovite middle class, really. And they brought Muscovite prices with them. And she said, yeah, it's been really noticeable for certain consumer goods. Inflation is quite intense. It's had quite a big impact here. That's me. I'll be back in London alongside you both in the studio for UTL and Battle Lines next week. Any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description of this episode. And as ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Alexis Ademora. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.